All right, so today we're gonna do a deep dive on family dynamics and conflict.
Ooh.
And we have a source here that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Lays out a pretty intense situation from one person's perspective about strained relationship between a daughter and her parents.
Okay, so when we approach something like this, it's really important to come at it with a sense of curiosity,
Yeah.
not judgment.
Right.
Family systems,
Mhm.
they're intricate puzzles, and sometimes the pieces don't quite fit together in a way that we might anticipate or that we might think they should.
That's a great way to put it. It's like a puddle where the pieces constantly change shape.
Yeah.
And in this case, this source definitely highlights some of those sharp edges.
Yeah.
You can practically feel the observer's frustration, anger, and even a little bit of fear about the future of this family.
Yeah, you're picking up on a key element there, the observer's own emotional state. They seem really worried about how the daughter is treating her father, the possibility of things escalating, and then kind of anxious about the potential long-term damage to everyone involved.
Right. There's this real sense of helplessness that comes through.
Yeah.
The observer wants things to change, but there's this underlying fear of things spiraling even further out of control.
Absolutely. It's like being caught between a rock and a hard place,
Yeah.
wanting to intervene and wanting to see a good outcome, but feeling paralyzed by the fear of making things worse.
Exactly. And there are some specific behaviors mentioned that really kind of add to the complexity of it all.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, the observer describes the daughter as being like a child stuck in the body of someone over 30,
Hmm.
which I have to admit kind of made me do a double take when I first read that.
That's a powerful image, isn't it?
Yeah,
And while we want to be careful about applying labels,
sure.
it does make us ask some interesting questions about emotional development.
Right.
It's as if the observer is sensing a disconnect between the daughter's chronological age and her emotional maturity.
So what does that actually mean?
Okay,
Is it like she's literally stuck at a younger age emotionally?
think of it this way. Imagine a tree that hasn't been getting enough sunlight.
Okay.
It might be alive, but its growth is stunted compared to trees that have more optimal conditions.
Right.
Similarly, sometimes our emotional growth can be hindered by tough past experiences, unhealthy family dynamics, or even just not having the right nutrients for emotional development.
Okay, I can see how that analogy fits. So
Yeah.
it's not like she's frozen at a certain age, but maybe some aspects of her emotional development haven't fully blossomed.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the source mentions some things that might be relevant here, like the loss of her grandparents,
Right.
a strained relationship with her extended family. These kinds of experiences can really impact how we learn to regulate our emotions and navigate relationships as we get older.
So it sounds like we're talking about a combination of nature and nurture. Maybe some innate tendencies, but also the impact of her environment and past experiences.
For sure. And to understand this current conflict,
Hmm.
we need to zoom out and look at the whole picture.
Okay,
What are the nutrients that have been missing? What sunlight has been blocked?
that's a good point. And speaking of those sharp edges we talked about earlier,
Right?
the source highlights this thing about the daughter needing to be right in every argument.
Mm.
The observer even says that it's like she's picking fights just to prove a point
Okay.
and then gets furious when her parents react.
That's really interesting because on the surface, it seems like she's in control. She's dictating the terms of the conflict.
Right.
But maybe underneath, there's a deep-seated insecurity driving that need to always be right.
Do you think it's like a defense mechanism then?
Okay.
Like she's trying to protect herself from feeling vulnerable?
It's possible. Imagine someone who has built a fortress around their heart.
Okay.
They might launch attacks from behind those walls.
Right.
But often it's because they're terrified of what might happen if someone got too close.
Wow. That's a really powerful image.
Yeah.
So maybe her anger is a shield.
Okay.
And underneath it all, there's fear or hurt that she doesn't know how to express in a healthy way.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because how do you have a productive conversation with someone who's constantly on the defensive?
Right.
How do you get past those walls to address the root of the problem?
That's a great question. And honestly, it feels a bit overwhelming just thinking about it.
It is understandable to feel overwhelmed when we see these complex dynamics at play.
Yeah.
But remember, even the most tangled knots can be unraveled with patience and the right approach.
Okay, so we've got this picture of a daughter who might be struggling with emotional maturity,
Yes.
possibly due to some unresolved issues from her past.
Right.
And she's expressing her frustration through anger and this need to be right all the time.
Yeah.
What about the other players in this puzzle? The source definitely gives the impression that the father is bearing the brunt of the daughter's anger.
You're right. And that brings us to another crucial layer of the story, the impact of this conflict on the father's well-being.
Right.
We know that the observer is concerned, even mentioning a fear that he might harm himself.
Yeah, that part really stopped me in my tracks.
Yeah,
It adds a whole other level of seriousness to the situation.
absolutely. And it highlights how important it is to recognize the warning signs of emotional distress,
Yeah,
not just in the person who is expressing anger outwardly,
right.
but also in those who are on the receiving end.
So while we're trying to understand the daughter's behavior and the potential root causes,
Yes.
we can't lose sight of the fact that her actions are having real consequences for the people around her.
Exactly. And that leads us to another important question.
Okay.
How do we support someone like the father in this situation?
Right.
How do you help someone who might be feeling overwhelmed, hurt, or even hopeless?
That's a big one, and it's something I'm sure our listeners are going to be really interested to hear more about.
We'll definitely get into that more in detail as we move forward.
Yeah.
But for now, I think what's important is to acknowledge that the father's pain is just as valid as the daughter's.
Agreed. And it's a reminder that family conflict isn't a zero-sum game.
Right.
There aren't winners and losers.
Exactly.
Everyone involved is impacted and deserves compassion and support.
Well said. And that brings us to the observer, who is clearly struggling with their own feelings about this whole situation.
Right. The source describes this mix of emotions:
Yeah.
frustration, anger, sadness, even guilt.
It's like they're caught in the middle of a storm,
Yeah.
just trying to keep themselves afloat while they watch the people they care about getting battered by the waves.
That's a great analogy, and it makes me think of this thing called emotional contagion.
Yes.
It's like catching a cold, but instead of germs, we're spreading emotions.
Right.
When someone close to us is feeling down, we often start feeling down too. And in a situation like this, where there's so much negativity,
Yeah.
it makes sense that the observer is feeling overwhelmed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the daughter and the father,
Right.
but also the ripple effects of their conflict on everyone else in the family system.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for the observer to prioritize self-care.
Yes. It's like putting on your own oxygen mask
Right.
before you help others on a plane.
Yeah.
You can't be a source of support if you're drowning yourself.
Oh, okay. I'm starting to see how this all fits together.
Okay.
We've got the daughter's struggles, the father's pain, and the observer's own emotional roller coaster ride.
It's a complex web of interconnected experiences, and we've only just begun to untangle it.
This is heavy stuff, but it's also incredibly insightful.
Yes.
Before we dive even deeper in part two, what are some key takeaways you want our listener to walk away with from this first layer of the source?
For me, it's recognizing that behavior is often a symptom of something deeper going on. Whether it's anger or control issues or even self-destructive tendencies, there's usually a story underneath that story.
And to understand that story, we
Mhm.
need to approach it with curiosity rather than judgment.
Exactly.
It's about asking questions, trying to see things from different perspectives,
Right.
and remembering that even the most challenging behaviors often come from a place of pain or unmet needs.
Yeah.
Okay, so stay tuned for part two, where we're going to unpack even more layers of this complex situation.
We'll see you then.
Yeah.
So before the break, we were talking about how the observer is really experiencing all the emotional fallout of this family conflict.
Yeah, it's like they're in the same boat, just trying to stay afloat amidst all the choppy waters.
Right.
And speaking of those choppy waters,
Okay.
the source mentions this interesting detail about the daughter's self-control.
Hmm.
Apparently, she has a hard time resisting tempting foods.
Okay.
And the observer kind of compares that to her lack of control when she's interacting with her parents.
What's interesting here is the connection the observer is making between emotional regulation and impulse control.
Right.
They're suggesting that her difficulty in managing her emotions might be linked to a broader struggle with self-discipline.
Okay, so it's not just about these anger outbursts.
Right.
It's about this deeper inability to regulate her responses.
Exactly.
Whether it's to a plate of cookies or a perceived slight from her father.
Exactly. And that points to like a potential developmental issue.
Okay.
Think of it like learning to ride a bike.
Right.
At first, it takes a lot of effort, to balance and steer.
Yeah.
But with practice, it becomes more automatic.
Yeah.
Emotional regulation is kind of similar. It's a skill that develops over time.
So some people pick it up more quickly than others.
Right.
And some people need more practice or support to really master it.
Precisely. And the observer even uses the phrase child stuck in the body of someone over 30,
Right.
suggesting that maybe she hasn't developed the same level of emotional maturity as her peers.
Okay, so we're seeing a possible link between the daughter's behavior, her struggles with emotional regulation, and
Right.
maybe some underlying developmental factors.
Yes.
But what about her words specifically?
Yeah, okay.
The observer recounts this particularly harsh exchange where the daughter tells her father, then leave.
Hmm.
And it just seems so incredibly callous,
Right.
especially given that we know from the observer that the father might be in a fragile emotional state himself.
That's such a heartbreaking detail. It seems contradictory, doesn't it?
Yeah.
On the one hand, she's pushing her father away, but on the other hand, she expresses fear that he might harm himself.
It's like she's testing his love, almost daring him to abandon her, even while expressing fear of that very outcome.
That's a great observation. It's like
Yeah.
she's saying, prove that you love me enough to stay, even when I'm pushing you away.
Hmm.
This kind of push and pull is actually really common
Right.
in relationships where there's a deep fear of abandonment.
So how does the father even navigate that? How do you respond to someone who's sending those mixed messages?
It takes a lot of patience, compassion, clear communication.
Okay.
It's about saying, I'm not going to tolerate disrespect, but I'm here for you when you're ready to talk in a healthy way.
That sounds a lot easier said than done.
Oh, for sure.
It must be so challenging to hold that line
Yeah.
while also trying to understand and support someone who's clearly hurting.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that the father has needs too.
Yeah.
He deserves to feel safe and respected within that relationship.
So it's not about enabling harmful behavior,
Right.
but about creating a space where both people can feel heard
Yeah.
and where their needs can be addressed in a healthy way.
Exactly. And that might mean seeking professional guidance.
Okay.
Family therapy can be really helpful in situations like this.
Sure.
It gives everyone a neutral space to talk about their feelings,
Right.
figure out the unhealthy patterns,
Yeah.
and learn how to communicate better.
That makes a lot of sense. Sometimes you just need that outside perspective.
Yeah.
To shed light on those blind spots that we can't always see when we're so caught up in all the emotions of a conflict.
Precisely. It's not about pointing fingers or placing blame.
Right.
It's about understanding the patterns at play and then giving everyone the tools they need to communicate and build stronger relationships.
The observer also mentions this thing about the daughter always needing to be right in every argument.
Okay.
It makes me think of like those online comment sections
Yeah.
where people are just battling it out, more focused on winning the argument than actually understanding each other.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights how this need to be right often comes from insecurity and a fear of being vulnerable. It's a way of protecting yourself from feeling wrong or flawed or unworthy.
Right.
But the irony is that this approach to conflict just creates more distance and resentment.
It's like they're building walls instead of bridges.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And real closeness requires a willingness to be open and vulnerable,
Yeah.
to say, hey, I don't have all the answers.
Right.
I might be wrong.
Yeah.
To kind of acknowledge our imperfections.
It sounds like a lot of the challenges this family's facing stem from a lack of that vulnerability,
Yes.
that willingness to really see and hear each other without all the judgment.
I think you're right. It's like they're all speaking different languages.
Yeah.
And they haven't figured out how to translate their needs and emotions in a way that everyone can understand.
And speaking of feeling misunderstood,
Right.
the observer is dealing with a lot of helplessness and guilt.
Yeah.
They want to help, but they're afraid of making things worse.
It's important to remember that the observer is also part of this family dynamic,
Right.
and their feelings matter.
Yeah.
So it's crucial for them to prioritize self-care as well.
So while they're trying to support the father and understand the daughter,
Yeah,
they need to take care of their own emotional well-being too.
absolutely. Setting boundaries is crucial in a situation like this.
Okay.
They can't control what the daughter does,
Right.
but they can control how much they engage
So it's about picking their battles. Yes.
and knowing when to step back to protect themselves.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the point that everyone in this situation needs support.
Yeah.
Even the observer. They're not a superhero. They can't fix everyone's problems.
That's such a good reminder.
Yeah.
You can't pour from an empty cup. You have to take care of yourself to be there for others in a way that's actually sustainable.
I agree. And sometimes the most loving thing we can do
Yeah.
is to encourage someone to get professional help.
Okay, so we've talked about the daughter's struggles with emotional regulation, the father's pain, the observer's need for self-care.
Yeah.
Before we move on to part 3, I want to go back to something else the observer mentioned.
Okay.
The daughter's age. They keep saying she's over 30.
Hmm.
Almost like they're surprised that someone her age would be acting this way.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
It speaks to that expectation that we should have it all figured out by a certain age.
Right.
Like emotional maturity is a given once you're an adult.
Yep.
But as we've seen, that's not always true. Life isn't a race everyone develops at their own pace.
Absolutely.
It's not fair to judge someone for not being where they should be emotionally.
Exactly. And sometimes the things we go through as kids,
Yeah.
those wounds can really stay with us,
Yeah.
affecting our relationships and our ability to handle conflict well into adulthood.
So it's not about judging someone for not being where they should be,
Right.
but trying to understand what factors have contributed to their current state and offering support on their journey towards healing.
Exactly. It's recognizing that everyone is on their own path
Yeah.
and that growth and change can happen at any age.
So welcome back to our deep dive into this really complex family situation we've been talking about.
Yeah.
In the previous parts, we really got into like all the emotional layers of the situation.
Right.
The daughter's struggles, the father's pain, and the observer feeling stuck in the middle of it all.
Yeah.
But now I'm really curious to kind of shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and explore some potential solutions. Like, what are some tangible steps this family could take to actually start building a healthier dynamic?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's important to acknowledge right from the get-go
Yeah.
that change doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
It takes time, it takes work,
Sure.
and it takes a willingness from everyone involved to actually want to shift those really deeply ingrained patterns.
So no quick fixes, but maybe some guiding principles to kind of get things moving in a more positive direction.
Exactly. And I think one of the most foundational principles is communication,
Okay.
but not just any communication.
Right.
We're talking about active listening, empathy,
Yeah.
a genuine desire to see things from the other person's point of view.
Okay.
It's like putting down your sword
Okay.
and picking up a pair of binoculars to try and see the world through their eyes.
That's such a great image swapping weapons for a tool that actually helps you understand the landscape better.
Right.
But let's be real.
Yeah.
That's a lot easier said than done.
Oh, for sure.
Especially when everyone's emotions are running high.
Yeah.
And there's already, a history of hurt feelings and misunderstandings.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important to set clear boundaries.
Okay.
It's not about shutting down communication altogether,
Right.
but protecting yourself from getting hurt
Yeah.
while still creating a space for dialogue that's actually productive.
Okay, so boundaries are like the guardrails on that bridge we were talking about earlier.
Yes.
Helping to keep the conversation from veering off into dangerous territory.
Exactly.
But what does that actually look like, practically speaking?
Imagine like the daughter starts yelling
Oh, okay.
or making accusations.
Right.
Instead of getting defensive or, engaging in a shouting match,
Yeah.
the father could calmly but firmly say something like, "Hey, I hear you're feeling angry and I want to understand why, but I'm not going to continue this conversation if you're yelling at me when you're ready to talk respectfully.
Yeah.
I'm here to listen."
So it's about acknowledging her feelings, but also setting a clear expectation for how the conversation needs to happen.
Exactly. It's about teaching her through your actions
Yeah.
that healthy communication means being respectful even when you disagree.
What if she doesn't back down, though?
Okay.
What if she keeps yelling or tries to escalate things even more?
That's where consistency is key.
Okay.
He has to follow through on that boundary.
Right.
It might mean leaving the room,
Yeah.
ending the phone call,
Right.
or even stepping back from the relationship for a little while if she keeps doing it.
Right.
It's about showing her that you mean what you say
Yeah.
and that you're serious about protecting yourself from that kind of verbal abuse.
It sounds really tough,
It is.
but I can see how it's essential to break those unhealthy patterns.
It is tough, especially when you love the person.
Yeah.
But remember, setting boundaries isn't about punishing them.
Right.
It's about protecting yourself
Yeah.
and creating a healthier dynamic for both of you.
So I've talked about communication and boundaries, but what about conflict resolution?
Okay.
Like, how do you actually resolve conflicts when there's so much hurt and resentment simmering beneath the surface?
It requires a shift in mindset,
Okay.
a willingness to let go of the need to be right all the time.
Right.
It's about realizing that understanding doesn't mean agreeing.
Okay.
You can listen to someone's perspective,
Yeah.
empathize with how they feel, and still have a different opinion.
That's a really subtle but important distinction.
It is.
Understanding versus agreeing.
Right, and it's about focusing on finding common ground,
Yeah.
working towards solutions that work for everyone.
Right.
Sometimes that means compromise.
Sure.
Sometimes it means agreeing to disagree.
Yeah.
But the key is to approach conflict from a place of collaboration, not competition.
I imagine that's super hard in this family, though,
It is.
where it seems like there's this history of one person always needing to win.
It is. And that's where getting professional help can be a game changer.
Okay.
Family therapy can provide a really safe and structured setting.
Right. For unpacking those deeply ingrained patterns.
Yeah.
A good therapist can be like a referee,
Okay.
helping everyone communicate better and find healthier ways to interact.
So therapy could be a really powerful tool.
Yes.
But it's not like a magic wand you wave and everything's instantly fixed.
No, it takes work.
Yeah,
And a real desire from everyone involved to make things better.
absolutely. And while we're on the topic of support systems,
Yes,
it's
yeah.
important to remember that everyone in this situation is probably going through a lot of emotional stress.
That's right. You're talking about self-care again.
Yeah.
Self-care is so important.
Right.
Not just for the person who shared this story,
Right.
but for the father and even for the daughter.
Yeah.
It's that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Right.
You have to take care of your own emotional, physical, and mental well-being
Yeah.
to show up for other people in a healthy and sustainable way.
So what would you recommend for someone in the observer's position?
Okay.
They're not directly involved in the conflict, but they're clearly carrying a lot of emotional weight.
I would say explore healthy ways to manage that stress and anxiety.
Okay.
Things like exercise, meditation, spending time in nature journaling,
Sure.
even hobbies that bring you joy and peace.
Yeah.
It's also crucial to set boundaries with the family.
Right.
Limit how much you're exposed to that conflict if you can.
So it's about recognizing your own limits.
Yes.
And knowing you don't have to be a superhero.
Right.
You can't fix everyone's problems, and it's okay to take a step back and take care of yourself.
Exactly. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is encourage someone to seek professional help,
Yeah.
whether that's suggesting therapy for the daughter
Right.
or maybe even a support group for the father.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best way to help someone is to empower them to find the resources they need.
Exactly. And remember, change is a process, not an event.
Yeah.
There will be ups and downs, steps forward and steps back.
Right.
But with patience, compassion, and a willingness to keep trying.
It is possible to build healthier and more fulfilling relationships.
Well, this deep dive has been so insightful.
Yeah.
We've explored the complexities of family dynamics,
Yes.
the impact of past experiences,
Right.
the importance of communication boundaries and self-care.
Absolutely.
And we've really emphasized the power of seeking professional help when it's needed.
Yes.
I know I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too.
I think so too. It's been a really rich and nuanced conversation.
Yeah.
And it really shows how important it is to approach these tough situations
Yeah.
with curiosity, compassion, and a commitment to growth.
Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final question to think about.
Okay.
How can understanding these dynamics that we've been talking about
Right?
help you in your own relationships, even the difficult ones? Take a moment and think about your own communication style, your boundaries, and your conflict resolution strategies.
Yeah.
What can you take away from this deep dive that might help you create healthier and more fulfilling relationships in your own life?
That's a great question to end on. And I think it highlights the fact that we all have a part to play in building better relationships.
Right.
It's not about blaming others.
Yeah.
It's about taking responsibility for our own actions.
Right.
And being willing to put in the work to learn and grow.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Yes. Thank you.
We hope you found it informative and insightful, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic